Hello everyone, David here. This is the second in a series of tutorials about virtual reality video. In the first episode, we talked about how to just get something recorded and uploaded to YouTube in the right format. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend you go back and watch that one first. In this episode, we're going to talk more about how to finesse that video, so how to take things like an unlevel horizon and correct it so that it's right, how to overlay text and graphics onto your virtual reality video and make them look right in virtual reality, and also how to do color correction so that it has a nice and comfortable feel. Okay, let's get started. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is horizon leveling. Now, here's my test clip. It's a video of us walking over Westminster Bridge. Now, what I've done is I've applied stabilization to it, and that's given it this nice sort of stable look. It's got rid of all of the jumping and hopping and tiny rotations that you would get just from walking naturally and holding a camera. But unfortunately, what's happened is it's got this kind of twist in the world. And if you viewed this in virtual reality, it would be quite uncomfortable because where you would think up is would not match with what you're seeing up in the virtual world. So it might make you feel kind of nauseous. And as you looked around, you would get this feeling of the land skewing in various directions. So we really want to fix this. And we're going to do this in Adobe Premiere Pro with some of its VR plugins. So if you go to Effects, under Immersive Video, go and find the effect called VR Projection, and we'll come and drag that down onto our clip here. And this gives us these sets of properties now. Most importantly, we're going to look at pan, tilt, and roll. I'm going to set them all to keyframes, and the reason why will become clear later. The aim is to get this horizon level by adjusting the tilt and roll until it looks right. And to some degree, you kind of just have to guess it. I'm just going to start changing the numbers here. Basically, I select it and then press up and down with the keyboard to make some fine adjustments. And yeah, that's looking a bit more right now. Sometimes it's difficult to get it bang on, but there should be some numbers that look much better than they did before. And as you can see, that now looks like a pretty level horizon, and that would look pretty comfortable to view in virtual reality. So let's play this video now. And I think this is going to be much better. What you hopefully will notice, though, as the video keeps playing, it actually starts to distort again. And this isn't because my numbers were wrong. It's actually a small amount of drift that can occur. So if you apply stabilization and let it run for a long time, you can get this slight drift where not only the horizon can go askew, but it can change over time, and also the pan can change over time as well. So we've corrected it here, but now towards the end of the clip, it's gone wrong. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some more adjustments here, and this is why I set it to use keyframes, because we're going to make new keyframes for the tilt and roll here, and we'll correct it again. So I'll just change these numbers until they match what I want. Yeah, and that's looking a bit better. So now we've got keyframes at the start of the clip and at the end, and so I know it looks right at the keyframes. What I'm hoping is that the change of the drift will match the change of these values as they're keyframed. So hopefully it will just sort of compensate for that as it goes. So let's go back to here and let's have a look through. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Let's check the midpoint. Yeah, so that's actually looking much better now. I think we may have got a bit lucky here and found that the drift was happening at a kind of linear speed. So by just setting two keyframes at the start and the end, we then managed to compensate for it. If there was still some kind of twisting going on, I would find the place where it looked the worst and then set keyframes and fix it. And then keep going and dividing your clip up into sections and adding keyframes and fixing it until you were basically tweening between all of these different changes over time and always compensating for the drift. The reason this happens could be down to one of several causes. Typically, the kind of numbers they're using to stabilize the camera will be floating point numbers, and these have an inherent inaccuracy when you start adding them up and multiplying them together. You lose accuracy the more calculations you do on them. So over time, they can drift out of sync. Also, the way sensor fusion works when it's trying to stabilize anything like a camera is that the gyroscope and the compass and all of the readings it's taking all feed into each other. So one of them drifting out can actually cause all of them to drift out of sync, and so we have to correct them. Or it could just be a bug in the software. The upside of that is that it could be fixed in the future. But I think drift is a problem that has been around for a while in 360 cameras and may stick around, so it's good to know how to fix it. So I want to show you that the effect is the same in VR 180. Here's a clip I recorded today in Victoria with no stabilization at all. You can see the camera is jumping around all over the place. If I apply the Human Eyes Shake stabilization, then it does improve it a little bit, but you still see this motion as the camera kind of bobs side to side as I walk. If I apply the Horizon stabilization, that's much better. So this is the one I want to go with, but it is going to need correcting in Premiere. It's exactly the same principle. So take your VR projection effect and put it on your clip. If you have your timeline set up correctly and you're using the same format of virtual reality video, you won't need to do this, but I need to specify that it's side-by-side input and I want side-by-side output. Keyframe the tilt and roll at the beginning and make the adjustments you need. And I'm going to do the same thing at the end. Yeah, I didn't need to change very much. Check the midpoint as well. I think it looks pretty good. And there we have it. Now my VR 180 clip is usable and I did exactly the same process. Okay, adding titles. Let's talk about how to add text and graphics overlaid on your video and make it look right in VR. Here's how. So let's pick our clip. I'm going to choose that same monoscopic 360 video clip. And the very first thing we want to do is have a way to view it or preview it in VR. And what you want to do is go down to this little plus button at the bottom right of the preview window and find the icon that looks like this one, and it's called Toggle VR Video Display. And we're just going to drag that over onto our toolbar here so that we get an extra button for VR video. And now what happens is if we press that button, we get to see what it would be like to view this clip in VR, and you can drag and move around and look at the clip from these different angles. So that's going to be really useful for us positioning text and graphics in the scene and then knowing what it's going to look like when we get it out at the other end. Let's put some graphics onto the scene. So I'm going to use this very generic looking company logo that I just grabbed off the internet. You'll see that if I just drag it onto the scene, it looks very rectangular. And if we view it in VR, we can see that that's not quite right. It sort of has this curvy look. And the reason this happens is because the whole video gets distorted when we view it in VR so that it looks like we're looking in a certain direction. And this graphic now doesn't have that effect applied to it. So there is a way to apply that effect. You go and find Immersive Video VR Plane to Sphere, and we drag that onto our effect. And boom, it now looks much more correct in virtual reality. Now it looks like the same shape it is, but in VR. It kind of looks like a big floating rectangle in front of us. There's a few things we can do to this as well. So if you go and find the effect parameters down here, VR plane to sphere, scale is literally like its size. So if we take that down a little bit, we can make the icon much smaller. Feather is how soft the edges are. So I actually want it to be really sharp at the edges, so I'm just going to reduce that to 0. And then probably the two most important, which are rotate source and rotate projection. Rotate source basically rotates it in place around the 3 different axes. And like that. And rotate projection rotates it around us. It rotates around the view. And so there's obviously a few different applications for this. If you had like a big tripod at the bottom of your shot and you wanted to get rid of it, you could actually rotate this graphic over to it to cover it up. So if we picked the right one, we could then rotate it towards the bottom of the screen. And then it looks like a mess here, but if we view it in VR and look down, we've got our company logo down there. So that's one way to cover up the tripod or your hand if you're holding the camera as you move. But what I want to show you is how to position it in the scene. So I'd quite like it over here on the left-hand side. So I'm going to rotate it around the y-axis in this direction so that it's sort of more or less aligned with the bridge. And then I might try and raise it up a bit. So this can take a bit of fiddling sometimes, but let's see what we can do. So try and get it up there. Yeah, let's have a look in VR. Yeah, so now we've got our company logo. I would like it to be sort of flat with the bridge as well, so I want to rotate this in place, and that will be a rotation along, I think it's x-axis, yeah. So now we've got a logo that's sort of floating in the air to our left-hand side. So if we were walking along the bridge, we'd see it floating over here. Let's play the video and have a look. Yeah, so there it is, floating in the air beside us. If we wanted it to move with the wind, we'd actually set multiple points for these rotation positions and then tween between them so that it appeared to stay in the same place. Now, this gets a lot more complicated for stereoscopic video, because instead of just overlaying one bit of text or graphic on top of the VR video, we now have to really overlay two, one for each eye, because of course stereoscopic video is always split between the two eyes. So let's check out how that bit works. First of all, we want to create our sequence, so I'll drag this video onto the timeline and create this sequence. What happens if I preview it now is that I get this horrible split down the middle, because the video itself is VR 180 stereoscopic side by side, but it still thinks it's monoscopic, so it doesn't know to send each of these to a different eye. So we can fix this by going into the sequence, right click on it here, sequence settings, and changing VR properties to equirectangular stereoscopic side by side. We actually have a horizontal view of 180 degrees and vertical is 180 as well. So now when I preview it, I see properly that I'm getting one eye, I'm getting the left eye, I think, of our VR 180 scene. So I can't see any depth, but it does at least look right when I preview it. Let's drag this logo on top of the video again. Let's put it somewhere. Yeah, that'll do. I'll set it to start there. But what you can see is that, once again, it's just bunged it right on top of the video. So if I were to preview this, I can't see the image in front of me. It's actually over here on the side of the view, which is completely wrong. So we need to go and find our immersive video effect, VR plane to sphere, and bung that on top of the effect. On top of the track. And now the company logo looks correct. It's still a little bit big, so let's scale that down. Yeah, something like that. And now that looks kind of right. But we have this horrible effect now where this will actually appear to be at a depth infinitely far away. It will have no stereo separation. And this will look really unpleasant because it's actually being drawn on top of things that are definitely closer than infinitely far away, like this part of a phone box here. So what I want to do is make the depth of this actually match the scene and feel like it physically is in front of these other things. And you might be thinking, well, that's going to be really hard to judge because I can't see in stereo on my 2D monitor, but there is a way to do it by using the old school 3D technique of anaglyph viewing. So if you go right click on your preview window and go to VR video settings, at the moment we're only seeing the left eye when we preview it, but I can change this to view an anaglyph view, and this is your classic red-green virtual reality 3D look of the world. And you can see that the phone box has this separation. And basically, the further apart the red and green lines are, that means the closer the object is to you. When there's no separation between them at all, that is infinitely far away. It kind of means both eyes are seeing the same thing. When they're different, that means both eyes are seeing very different things, because of course the way red-green glasses work is that they filter all of the red out of one eye and all of the green out of the other, so that they can see different images. So I want my company logo to have as much or more separation than, say, this phone box. The key thing is this stereo disparity. So I'm going to set a keyframe on that, and I am going to increase that. So that's going to be really, really, really close. So I want to set the separation to something a bit more than the phone box, so it feels like it's sitting more in front of it. Let's just play a bit of this video. So that keeps it at the depth in front of me, which may be what you want, but I suspect that you'll want something to kind of feel like it's sitting in the scene and it's actually staying in the same place in the 3D world. And to do that, you will animate that stereo disparity value. Here's an example. This is some footage I shot from a drone while I was flying in Kyiv in Ukraine. And the drone starts off in the air and then flies backwards and up. I wanted this bit of text that says Vuze XR was used to film to stay in the same relative position and to feel like it's lying on top of the snow. And to get this effect, I had to animate the scale, because it obviously gets smaller as it gets further away, the stereo disparity, because it gets relatively more depth away from the viewer, and the rotate projection as well, because it has to stay in the same place on the screen, but the whole world is moving, so it needs to move with it. So let's just watch this in slow motion. So hopefully you can see it have some effect there. And if we preview that in VR, you can see there's quite a lot of stereo separation here, like the red and green is quite far apart. And I used this tree as reference because it was at about the same depth as that. And as it plays and it gets further away, the red and the green get slightly closer together as well. And this is because when you look at something really far away, like the moon, your eyes are parallel and they're looking at almost exactly the same image. However, when you look at something really close up, like your finger in front of your face, your eyes are more cross-eyed and they're getting a very different image of that object. So if you were to then filter out the differences to red and green, you would see very different things. Okay, let's move on to everyone's favorite subject, which is color correction. Allow me to introduce you to our test clip for this section. This is a video of me walking through the tube in the London Underground system, and this is in need of some color correction. You'll find that if you shoot with automatic white balance on your 360 camera or VR 180 camera, you'll occasionally get a clip that needs a little bit of color correction, and sometimes you'll get a clip that needs a good shove in the right direction to sort it out. This happens because the camera is trying to adjust for what it thinks white looks like in your scene, and white can look very different if you're shooting on, say, a cool winter's evening compared to, say, a glorious sunset. The glorious sunset is going to look much more yellow. So when cameras try to adjust for this, they tint it more blue or more yellow, and sometimes it gets it wrong, or sometimes it just makes something that looks not quite as pleasant. So we are going to look at how to correct for that, and also how to improve the general kind of feel of the video in virtual reality. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so let's have a look at this clip. It generally, to me at least, looks kind of yellowish and also a bit kind of greenish. I don't really like the tint of this. I know that this is supposed to be a kind of creamy, it should be whiter than it looks here. So I'm going to play with the color correction for a while until I think it looks better. I'm also just going to say that it looks a little bit too dark as it stands right now. It kind of is generally dim, and I think that's because these very bright strip lights at the top have made the camera adjust the exposure down. So it's tried to balance everything, but unfortunately, because these are sort of blown out white, it's meant that everything else has got a bit darker as a result. So the very first thing I'm going to do is go to the basic correction over here. And if you can't see this straight away, it's under Lumetri Color on the effects panel in Premiere. And the very first thing I want to change is exposure, and I'm just going to give that a bit of a lift until it feels a bit more comfortable. Now that's too much, but something like there is starting to match the lighting conditions that I remember from the scene. And that's 1.6 stops brighter, so that's quite a bit. In fact, I might just reduce that a little bit. Contrast, now this can be a bit of a debatable one. I like to give it a little bit more, just so it has that kind of a bit more of a crunchy bite to it. It makes it a bit more interesting. I would say if you're making 2D video, flat video for YouTube, or for general consumption on your phone, you have the freedom to play with this a little bit more and make something artistically more interesting. But for virtual reality, you want to make sure you don't go over the top, because people are going to be looking at your scene. Highlights and shadows, I might give the shadows a little lift as well, but something quite subtle. Whites and blacks, I'll leave them as they are for now, because we've got some strong whites in the scene here and some blacks around here in the window and some of these clothes as well, so I think that's fine. But I do want to do something about this sort of tint that's going on here, and I'm just going to try adjusting this a bit with the temperature slider. So this is kind of what controls what it thinks white is in the scene, and if I make it more yellowy, that's starting to get really, really warm, and if I take it back down to blue, that would make it feel cooler. And actually, I think down here is where it's starting to feel more natural to me. That kind of matches the colours of the scene better. Now we've got a kind of blue and yellow tint control here, and then there's this extra tint control between green and purple. And I think actually there's a bit more green in the scene than there should be, so I'm just going to tint that towards purple. Now that's too much, obviously, but just something around there. I might just bring this back in a little bit. Cool, so that to me looks a lot more natural than it did a while ago. I'm going to play with the saturation a little bit as well. I think that doesn't really require much adjustment at all, so I'm just going to leave that at 100% unchanged. Just to compare what it looked like a second ago, this is with the effect off, and this is with it on, and I think this looks like such a more interesting and dynamic scene now. So let's preview it in VR. Yeah, so there you go. That's how to make some minor adjustments that really take very little time at all, but really kind of make your scene feel a lot more comfortable, and that would be a much more pleasant and interesting scene to watch in virtual reality. If you have a lot of these clips and they were all shot under the same conditions, for example, I'll just paste this out, then you may want to use an adjustment layer to make these changes instead, and that's very easy to do. You just come down here, select New Item, Adjustment Layer, usually got the right settings there, drag it over on top of your clip, and then make it so that it covers all of your clips. And then instead of doing the Lumetri correction for the effect on the clip itself, you would actually make the Lumetri change on the adjustment layer, and then it would apply to all of the clips that were covered by the layer. Bear in mind that your viewer is going to be surrounded by your video in every direction, so try to avoid making it too intense, and I would definitely avoid making it pure white in every direction to avoid burning their eyes out. Okay, that's it for color correction. Let's just go over the 3 things I've covered in this video as a kind of quick recap. Number 1 was horizon leveling. Make sure you use the immersive video VR projection effect to level your horizon, and also set keyframes if it's a particularly long video so that you can have constant correction throughout the length of the clip. Number 2 was overlaid text and graphics. Use the VR plane to sphere, Make sure your VR sequence settings match what kind of VR video you're using as an input and what kind of VR video you're making. And then make sure you move it in the scene and also animate that movement if you need to as well. And finally, color correction. Don't just leave your video as it is, don't be lazy. Actually go in, change with the basic correction effects, the lumetri color, and change that exposure, contrast, and the color tint, as well as the color balance.
Well, I hope all of that was useful. If it was, then please hit the like button down there, and you can help me out by subscribing to my channel as well. Okay, see you next time.